Everybody, this is Paul Hitchcock, and thanks for joining Wealth Protector TV. Really excited to have our two guests today. Bruce Norris, who, Bruce, you're many things, an investor in property, an economist, I would say, also on property to a certain extent.
Without a degree, but...
Yeah, no degree, but a lot of experience. And I have also our founder here at Barth, Harry Barth, who's a noted expert across the country in asset protection. So this is going to be a great discussion. And a couple of things. One is we're recording this, so all attendees will receive a recording of this afterwards. We will get that out to you, so look for that. And then also, if you have questions that come up on this presentation, we're going to give you an opportunity as a follow-up to get those questions addressed in one-on-one sessions with either Bruce or Harry. And so keep that in mind. And with that, we're going to start, Bruce, with you. And this is modeled after a talk you give frequently about the top decisions that property investors need to make right now. So maybe you could start there and kind of get into what your thinking is for investors here in California.
One of the most important things that I had to learn on my own was the idea of timing. It wasn't always one answer fits all, and I found that out in 1989, and I was aggressively doing things in the 80s, and everything worked fine. And I got to a project with 7 custom homes in 1989, got them done by June of 1990, and everything changed. And so I wish I had a warning to say maybe you should do something different than what you have been doing, because California switches gears and can go down in price. And so fortunately, because of that, I went through a couple of hard years, but solved everything. But because of that event, I was able to avoid 2008 because I could see that one coming, got out of Dodge. And so now we've had another really good run up. And so it's appropriate to take a look at your asset base. And I'm not saying you're going to have a repeat of 2008. What I am saying is that we've reached a number relative to the United States price. We're about 220%. Whenever we get over there, there's usually a slowdown in California, and we meet a number, maybe 160%. A few years later where the price is condensed. I don't want to hold the wrong inventory during that cycle. Most investors get really good deals on marginally located inventory. And they get a good enough deal, they keep it as a rental. That's the inventory that gets hurt in a downturn. So the inventory that I sold to go to Florida was bought for 65 grand that went up to 4 times that, 270,000. I would bet money that that'll be 150 grand at the bottom of the next downturn. Not saying that every piece of inventory is going to go down by that percentage, but that area probably will, because only 20% of the world wants to live there.
And when you're talking inventory, I mean, this sort of input applies to what's that inventory? Multifamily? I mean, well, what is it?
My experience level is always single family.
Single family.
I do a fair amount of speaking, and I get in front of apartment owners, and it's very interesting on their take of what they think of their properties. Right. So it's not that I've owned them, and the only reason I didn't own them, honestly, is I never liked living in them. That's honest. That's maybe a bad economic reason, but I almost thought, why would I want to put 100 renters in a place that their whole goal is to leave? That's how I view apartments. I didn't want somebody in a common wall on top of me. Right. My goal was to get the heck out of there. So I always wanted to own single-family houses because they're pretty stable tenants and sometimes there for many years.
When you're talking to people, what do you see mostly in portfolios? Are these people that have 1 or 2 properties? They have quite a few? You know,
our client base may be not usual, so I've met with dozens of them more recently, and I would say the majority of them have over 10, some of them over 50. But that's, I think, our clientele is kind of maybe unique. And then there's an occasional apartment owner in there, and of course, when you look at their net worth, they've made some really good decisions owning that stuff. So,
right. Yeah, well, and here I was going to ask you too, because as we're getting into this and talking about, property owners, we're going to get more into the market and your thoughts on where people should move. Is the issue always comes up, and we're dealing with a lot of property owners across the country. You speak to a lot of groups. The proper structure of those properties, whether it's a single family or something else. So for investors out there, they can get hurt by market cycles, but also what about the asset protection side of it and owning property?
Well, I think before we even get into talking about asset protection for property owners specifically, there's some general principles of asset protection that I think are critical that everybody needs to know about.
Right.
And I think the most important of them all is that we should not be engaging in asset protection planning after we've had an event. So if we had a fire, at the property and people were injured or perhaps killed, or if we had, mold situations that have emerged, or as an owner, we've crashed our car, killed 2 people and being sued personally, that's when we get a tremendous number of calls to the asset protection attorney. Can you help me now?
Right.
I have a problem. So let's understand that all asset protection planning needs to be proactive and preemptive in order to be effective and properly and professionally
And it doesn't have to be a lawsuit, right? It could be just a sniff of something happened, not necessarily a lawsuit.
Yeah, that's the classic. We get, we've had this problem, but we haven't been sued yet.
Right.
The actual cause of action occurred when the event occurred, not when a particular lawsuit arises. So I think that's an important component. A second important component for all of us that we need to know, we'll call it an urban myth, that living revocable trust, the trust that we put together for our estate planning, for our distribution plans for our families, provide no asset protection. And third, one of the difficult problems is that many of us have an over-reliance on insurance. Insurance is very, very important in asset protection planning, but I think that it's critical to understand that we may get a judgment that's in excess of our insurance. We may have a problem that's not covered by insurance. A lot of people feel good they have insurance, but insurance in many cases is a promotion of litigation. Insurance is just a means to pay for that litigation. And 2, a lot of people don't recognize that all of a sudden they say, well, I thought my insurance company is my friend and not my adversary. And they realize that the insurance company is there to deal with themselves and not necessarily deal with us.
Well, the contract's this long, right? The insurance contract.
Yeah, 65 pages of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. So we'll come back to the individual structuring, but there's one other little component that's important for all property owners to understand, that liabilities are 2 different types of liabilities. We have inside out and outside in liabilities. And inside out liabilities are liabilities that rise up as a result of owning property. We own property, we're a landlord, and so it's a landlord-tenant liability. That's the mold issues, the fire issues, the security issues, all of the issues rising up from the operations of the real property. So those are inside out liabilities. And then the other form of liability, we'll talk about how we structure around those, is outside in. So if Bruce, you're the owner of real property, what will happen is that, and we have a liability that's unrelated. Your wife crashed the car and killed 2 people, and now to the Norris family, we're looking down and you have liability. We look down, what do you have that we can use to satisfy that claim? And there's another issue of Wealth Protector TV with myself and a collection attorney, Martin Greenbaum, where we actually go through what they would do to try to collect those assets and what can we do to protect those assets that we work so hard for. And just let me, without taking too much time, a very important component. So Bruce, if you had built your whole retirement future based upon qualified retirement plans, defined benefit plans, pension plans, the things that we used to talk about on Saturday morning with all the pension people, and we have a family liability, those assets are 100% exempt from the claims of creditors, pretty much under federal and state law. But you and I, we build our portfolios by owning real property as landlords, even though it's our retirement plans, those are subject to the claims of creditors unless we take steps to protect them.
Right. Yeah, great, solid information.
Did you bring me here to scare me? Is that
I'm just scared.
Are you frightened yet?
Already.
Oh, he's just started, believe me.
I'm just getting underway.
Well, Bruce, one of the things as I look at some of the hot button issues you talk about is spotting key warning signs, and also you talk about why we are in the 8th inning here in a cycle. Can you comment a little bit about those things?
Sure. What's very interesting is we've never had this exact set of charts with this result. Affordability is at 28%. Unemployment is as low as it's been for 50 years. Sales are flat. Foreclosures are non-existent, so you don't have any competition from foreclosures. With those set of charts, you should have prices cranking up 20% a year until you get affordability at 17. That happened going up to 1980, 89, 2005 and 6. This time we're at 28%. Sales are at a 10-year low, and prices are probably month over month are going to invert and be less than 2018, maybe for the rest of the year. That's never happened before. So that made me understand. I was always waiting. I mean, honestly, I was waiting for this to kick off. We usually have 4 years of tremendous sales at the end of each cycle, flatter than a pancake. And now we're having an issue with prices. We have an issue with migration leaving, et cetera. It dawned on me, you know what, we're not going to have it this time. This time is actually different. Even with an interest rate that's 4% and affordability high, I think we're pretty much at the end of a residential cycle. Now, what's going to make it safer? At 28% affordability, that's a lot higher than 17. You know, usually at 17, you've reached the brink. Everybody is in. Everybody was motivated to get in. Everybody stretched their budget. And if you're in a legitimate lending environment, 17% is the breaking point where lenders just eventually have to say no en masse to the request of financing.
What does that mean? When you say 28% of affordability,
Yeah,
what does that actually mean?
Affordability is a mathematical equation. You take a median price assumption is a 20% down, giving a loan balance, match the fixed interest rate, and which households, what percentage of households afford it. And how they figure that out is there's bands of income. So it's not median income, but it's little bands of income. So how many people make 200 to 210 and so forth. And so you get to the band of income that you currently are at. Let's say right now it's 125,000. 28% of California's households make that money. It's not looking at any of their debt. It's not that refined.
Right.
But it's basically, that's what it's saying. That's the affordability. Well, we're usually at 28%. We are high in affordability and will run to 17 on the backs of tremendous price increases. There's other factors, interest rates declining, increase affordability, wages increasing, increase affordability, price increases, decrease it, interest rate hikes. So it's interesting that we have this environment where, and this is what's fascinating, the federal situation as far as the Fed not being able to increase interest rates past where they are with this kind of unemployment that's also unusual. We don't get there at 2.5, we get there at 6. Because
unemployment's so low, but it's not leading to...
I mean, you've got a decent economic growth still. You got, what, 3.5% just showed up, full employment, and the Fed can't raise past 2.5 because they're afraid of what? So if they're afraid of a recession at this level, you've got to look backwards. So we just had an inverted yield curve a couple months ago. Well, it's significant because it's pretty accurate to say you're going to have a recession coming. But the last time it inverted, it was 6%, time before 6.5, time before that 8. So we've never had an inversion at 2.5. And why that's significant is that generally the Fed lowers the interest rate 4 to 5 percentage points when a recession occurs so they can build in some momentum economically. Right. Well, how are we going to do that at 2.5? If we do it, we'll be at negative rates. If we don't do it, well, then they're going to do some more quantitative easing or we're going to have a lousy comeback.
When you're talking like that, I was going to say, I think one of the reasons the Fed hesitates to raise the rates is they don't want to get slammed on Trump's Twitter feed over there. They try to raise. But when you're talking about that, is that a general statement about, investing in California, or is it still a pocket scenario? And there's pockets, Marin County, Orange County, that are hot, that are not subject to that scenario you create, or is it pretty across the board?
It's pretty across the board. And that's what I try to do. I try to look at state statistics rather than local, like county by county. Everybody has their history.
Yeah.
But how I come to that conclusion is I look for a number that creates a problem, a series of negative charts after that. And so I didn't invent it. I mean, I really tried to find it out because I'm trying to invest my own money wisely and not have a repeat of 1990 to 92 for myself. So when I look at affordability at 17%, why it became significant is 2 years after that event, you have explosion in inventory, explosion in foreclosures, declining sales, declining construction, all those negative things within 24 months of 17% affordability. Well, at 28% affordability, we're starting to act like we're at 17. And while related that to the federal situation, we've got full employment, a low interest rate, a GDP that's still strong, and yet we feel like we're going to push it into recession if we go any further. And it just feels tentative on both counts.
Right. Yeah.
That the real estate in California and the Fed not being able to get past 2.5 is sort of the same reason. It just feels like there's like behind the scenes, something's not normal.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I imagine, Harry, I was going to ask you on this. I imagine, on Bruce's side, with this scenario, that you evaluate your portfolio, right? You're trying to protect your portfolio by diversifying, getting out of the state or whatever you're doing. How do you counsel folks who have a portfolio property on protecting it on our side of the equation?
Okay, well, now in this segment, let's talk a little bit about the inside protection.
Okay.
So here's what we say. We see people that'll have no inside protection whatsoever. So if the living irrevocable trust or the individual or the married couple are the owner of the rental property, if we have a liability at that rental property, we will sue them individually because they are the landlord, and then they become liable not just for the value of the property where the event occurred, but to the full extent of their net worth. So their home, their bank accounts, their other properties, anything that they have, other than perhaps a few series of exempt assets, will be subject to that claim. So one of the things that we always strongly recommend is that we form a limited liability entity to hold that property. So if we have a property that's worth $400,000, $500,000, $1 million worth of equity, encapsulated inside the limited liability entity, and we have a lawsuit against that entity, which is the landlord, the liability is limited under most circumstances to the amount of equity that's in that particular box, and not more than that. And I think that's very, very important. And there are different, depending on the state that we're in, there are some different forms of that. A limited liability company, a limited partnership is used. And in some states, not in California, a limited liability, limited partnership. There's a triple LP, which are all forms of the same thing. In other words, we don't want to have a liability rise up and become malignant and take down all of our assets. So what we see in those areas, it's better we pick the amount of equity that we're willing to have at risk and encapsulate that equity inside that particular limited liability entity, and that should be it. So if I have $800,000 worth of equity inside that particular box, and the landlord has a judgment against it for $5 million, it's an $800,000 liability, and it doesn't move beyond that. So one of the things that we see with people that are owning series of single-family home rental properties is that they will have a tendency sometimes to create one limited liability entity and place all of those properties inside that one limited liability entity. So when you think about that, that doesn't make much sense from an asset protection perspective, because then what will happen is that the net equity of the landlord is the entire amount of money of equity that's sitting inside that box. So if I have 20 single-family homes and each one has $100,000 worth of equity, that landlord has a $2 million net worth. But it gets a little bit worse in this respect from a risk perspective, is that we also now have 20 families, and we have 20 sets of workmen, and we have 20 sets of guests, and 20 sets of invitees, and 20
all in
children.
one bucket.
All targets, potential liability targets against a larger pool of equity. So the best we do is using common business sense, is to try to isolate those pods, from one piece of property with $1 million or $500,000 worth of equity, maybe in its own box, and collectively put some in another box, taking into consideration the location of the property, what state that it's in, and the rules that are governed. So I think when we're looking at an inside liability and inside out, that's a very important component.
Well, I got to ask you this because it floored me. We had a webinar a couple weeks ago with a landlord attorney. Brad was doing it, and this landlord attorney brought up the fact that they're seeing a lot of mold claims with property. This exploding, and people are just going for it. And he described the scenario of tenant sues landlord for a mold claim. ends up in court, the tenant gets awarded $300,000 and has to pay attorney's fees, which were $1.7 million. So in that case, no asset protection. What happens in that case? So now there's a $2 million judgment. Are they going for it?
Yeah, well, they have a $2 million judgment by the court, and they will look at all of that individual's assets that are non-exempt and attempt to collect the $2 million. So
Like even the guy's home?
even the guy's home. Depending upon the state's homestead exemption, they're just for everybody.
California.
So let's do California. So in California, a single owner of a primary residence will get an exemption of $75,000 worth of equity. A married or two-owner ownership of a single-family home will get $100,000 of equity exemption. And for those of age 65, if we have a person age 65 and over living in the property, or a disabled person living in the property, then that exemption is increased to $175,000.
Oh, they're generous.
So if we have more than the exemption amount, then the home will be sold at a forced sale. It actually does happen. And you'll get a check for the exemption amount.
Unreal.
Yeah, so a lot of people don't recognize that it's not just the liability, but there are attorney's fees involved, depending upon the cause of action. It could be significant.
Right. Bruce, so getting back to the the portfolio scenario, what do you do at this point if you've got a portfolio of properties, whether it's 2 or 3, and they subscribe to your advice here? What action do you actually take to minimize risk?
Well, as far as financial risk, I was sitting with clients, so they'd call me up and say, okay, take a look at my portfolio. And so the recommendation wasn't known until I asked questions. And so which of these do you want to keep forever? So there's some of their portfolio that's well located, it's in a great area, or it's free and clear, but it's a really good property and they want to keep it. That's great. I said, how many of these properties do you not like at all? And so maybe 30% of their portfolio was just bought because it was a discount. It was in 1,000 Palms or 29 Palms or, who knows what. It was 70 years old and had always, the only potential tenants were marginal tenants because that was all who would go there. And so those are the properties that probably went up 400% that I target and say, you know what? I would not necessarily want to own that for the next 5 to 10 years because that's not going to be a positive pricing environment to me.
Right.
And so that I would exchange for something. Now, I chose Florida because of what drives their business is seniors. So seniors migrating there, the number one state for seniors already there. They're the number one migration of money in the country by far. So they're number one, and that number one is more than 2, 3, 4, and 5 combined.
Money coming from other states?
Yes, who moved to Florida.
Florida, yeah.
That's significant because that means they're going to spend money, and it also means that as we get older, we need more health care.
Yeah.
So that's the biggest factor for me is when you're 65, there's 2 people like nurses in your life, and when you're 85, there's 7. You think about that math, it means that for the migration of the senior is already
Big
there.
deal, yeah.
There's a 350% more migration of healthcare workers that will show up. That's a big deal.
Interesting, yeah. Fascinating numbers, yeah.
Yeah, so that's why I'm there. It's the most foolproof business model I know. The likelihood of me getting a year older next year, if I'm here, it's got to happen. And it probably means I'm going to see a nurse a few more times. So I like that business model, and that's why we're there. I have inventory there. I thought it was really close to a place called Leesburg and the Villages. The Villages is a really well-known retirement. I thought my renter would likely be a senior that didn't want the Villages environment, which is everything's contained.
Yeah.
And you get a golf cart, you go play golf and go to the movies. It's all right there. My renter's a nurse that takes care of the senior that lives there, and I didn't expect that.
Oh.
And how they get there and want to rent is they're actually they build a facility and they don't have the nurses there. So it's sort of like you have a tech job in San Jose. It's like, can you move here?
Yeah.
We need nurses. And so they make them bonuses. And so they don't land there and buy something. They land there and rent.
Can a nurse or someone who's not a senior rent in a senior complex?
No, I don't think so. I think that's senior, but since they're needed, they don't want to buy a home like that. So they rent first.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of yeah. Well, what's kind of interesting gets me to your point on the talk that you do about building your team, the team you need to have going forward. You
Yes.
mentioned that. What are you talking about there? Who's that team?
Well, before I did this once before in Grand Junction, Colorado, so I was not that old. I was 32, had a chance to buy in Grand Junction at 20 cents on the dollar. Oil shale crashed, and I mean, I was like the lone Mohican. I was making offers, and I realized there's no one else in America that wants this stuff. And so I took my time, and I literally interviewed every broker, every property manager, personally, and put together the best team I could from a distance, because that's very difficult. Everything from a distance is harder.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is magnified, your repairs. So the trust level has to be absolute. And so that's basically building a team of people that manage it, fix it, the brokers that find it.
The asset protection attorney who
That's
guards
right.
it.
Apparently, I'm going to need him really quickly. No, that's all important pieces of it, because you've got to trust from a distance. I'm buying building lots from a guy that calls me up and says, okay, the lot is worth this. You can buy it for this. It's going to produce this kind of revenue when you build this expensive of a
Right.
home. What's the odds of me getting that told the truth? If I'm an investor from California,
Right.
it's almost zero unless you physically go there and put people through the test.
Mhm.
And then it's even, I prove stuff. So after I was told something, I literally would hire an appraiser. I said, on this building lot, there's going to be this square footage home. Tell me what it's worth. No direction from me. I'd like it to come in somewhere.
Mhm.
I just want to know the truth.
Yeah.
And so when that came in within 1% of the stated value, it told me more about the person than the property. I was being told the truth,
Yeah.
which is important.
Yeah. No, I think it's a great comment about the team. And Harry, how does that play into, your side of the equation? If somebody's, moving property around or investing in something, how does that change, the LLC or maybe the estate plan they're moving around? How does it affect the planning?
Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that are involved with multi-state properties. And a lot of people don't recognize this. So a lot of people will have properties in Indiana and Florida, Montana, and they're residents of California. And many people, sadly, don't have those properties, not necessarily from an asset protection perspective, from an estate planning perspective, titled in their trust.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll have it in their own name, joint tenancy, tenancy by the entirety, tenancy in common. In the event of death, all right, so what happens is that those properties actually create an ancillary probate in every single state. So there'd be a probate in California, a probate in Montana, a probate in Nevada, a probate in Florida.
With all the costs for
With
each
all
one,
the
right?
costs associated with that to get it done. So for the proper utilization from an estate planning point of view and probate avoidance, having those properties titled in your living revocable trust will avoid the ancillary probates. The other issue in moving properties around, I want to just kind of switch to what I alluded to earlier, is the outside-in liability.
Right.
So the outside-in liability is slightly different. So we've already talked about trying to compartmentalize our properties into we'll call it manageable chunks from an asset protection perspective, from a landlord-tenant liability. I think a lot of people recognize that. But a lot of people don't recognize, and a bigger issue is that sometimes the liabilities that we have, all of us have, come not as a result of being landlords, but come as a result of just being a human being in the United States of America, where a liability can come to us from many, many different sources. Driving cars, operating boats, having a dog, a big dog that can bite and attack somebody. Owning a business and having a wage and hour lawsuit or a sexual harassment lawsuit, whatever it may be. So the liability is coming to us. So the liability comes to us, and we are the owners of real estate.
Mm-hmm.
So now the question would be, and if let's say if even a good percentage of our net worth is in real property, so what happens is that if they get a liability to me, and to satisfy that liability that's not insured, they'll look down at my property and take my property. So they'll place a lien on my property, they'll foreclose on that property, they'll sell that property, give the proceeds to the creditor, and I've lost that which I've built up. So The other side of the asset protection that's critical is structuring our asset protection in such a way that in the event there is a liability to Bruce, liability to Harry, when they look down at our portfolio of property, that the plaintiff would be unable to reach inside and sell off our property. Mm-hmm. So what we're trying to do there is to limit the plaintiff's ability to reach our properties by structuring our limited liability entity in such a way that the best that they should be able to get is a lien, known in the business as a charging order, on the distributions that come out of our property.
Wow.
So most of the time we would accumulate either money's going to come from, Bruce, you tell me, it's going to come from rental income, mm-hmm. or it's ultimately going to come from an equity sale of properties, the two places where it comes from. So if structured properly, the creditor will not be able to reach, they can't force us to make a distribution because they get no managerial control. So that's really good. What they can get when structured properly is just that lien on distributions without the ability to force us to make a distribution, which would allow us to 1031 our properties within that LLC, would allow us to sell the property within that LLC without a disturbance from that plaintiff who may have a significant judgment against us, allow us to take the rental income, make repairs, and accumulate that money within a savings account within that LLC, and the creditor still can't do anything, waiting for a distribution to take place. So I would think that I would much rather be in that negotiable position with my portfolio of property. Yeah. And in many instances, the tax law is interesting. As we all know, as owners, that sometimes we can create what is known as phantom income. So phantom income is that although we have accumulated all that rental income that we have not distributed because they cannot force us to distribute it, tax still has to be paid on that rental income. And due to some rules in the Internal Revenue Code, it's highly probable that the creditor that has taken that charging order lien would be the one that has to pay the rental income, the tax on the rental income, with no cash being distributed.
Wow.
And I think that leaves us in a much better position to negotiate a fair and favorable settlement, or to have a settlement within the insurance policy limits that we've taken as responsible citizens to do. I think that, again, understanding just for the purposes of our audience, that we can't be doing those things after the event. Right. We have to have it structured properly. And then in my next segment, I'll talk a little bit about lending and the proper utilization of lending. I know Bruce is an expert on that. I'd like to discuss that as well.
Yeah, and I want to, that's great, Harry, thank you. And I want to get to this question. So we had some people send in some questions ahead of time, and we've got one here. And I asked you ahead of time if you wanted me to set you up with this question. You said no, you're going to wing it. It would scare me, but here we go. So San Diego, live in San Diego, own 2 small multi-unit rental properties in a medium-priced neighborhood. How will a real estate downturn affect rental rates short and long term? It goes on, historically, in case of a downturn, are higher-priced areas like La Jolla less impacted than lower and medium-priced areas? We're looking to purchase a single-family home in La Jolla with mild deferred maintenance for a relatively good price at 563 square foot. The loan would be largely carried by the positive cash flow from our rental properties. The plan, I'm going to read the whole thing and go back. The plan is for a limited remodel update. We can do so inexpensively as the architect, developer, contractor, live in it for 2 to 5, and then sell it for good profit. Currently, homes in the area with similar modern updates sell for 1,000 square foot. Is this a good time to undertake such a project in regard to market conditions and forecasts? That's kind of a long question. Yeah.
Okay, impact of rent. That probably will be mild because there is a lot of people still looking for rentals. And so if you go into a downturn, I don't see that as a big hit. Now, cap rates, another question.
Right.
When you say small units, that really wasn't defined. So I don't know if they're a fourplex or if they're considered a unit anything over 5. That world is at a cap rate it's never been at. So I had a friend of mine that his son went into commercial property, and he asked for an hour to meet with me, and I met with him, and he showed me a flyer, and he said, help me sell this investment, and the cap rate was 2.9%. I said, I can't help you sell it because I wouldn't buy it myself. I wouldn't see any reason for that. I don't see how you get an equity going forward. It's too high.
Yeah.
So that would be my concern. If I spoke recently to an apartment owners association, and recently every time I speak there twice a year, every seat's taken and they're lined on the wall. So you're either going, okay, you guys are either really scared or really, really excited. Which one is it?
Yeah.
And so the question always comes up. We want to know if apartments are in bubble territory. I said, I'm not an apartment guy, but I can ask one question and you will tell me. How many of you would buy your own apartment building at today's valuation? And honestly, rolling laughter happens every time. That's the definition of a bubble.
They wouldn't.
They wouldn't. Of course they wouldn't.
Yeah.
It's a stupid price. They know that.
Yeah.
Well, stupid prices don't usually go up more. They have a tendency to go down. So I would just, you know what? That doesn't mean you sell an apartment building. Same thing.
Right.
What if you own it free and clear? It's in a perfect location and you don't care if the rents will go down. You own it free and clear and it's providing great income for you and you're protected and all that. Then leave it alone. But if you got in it for it to go up and it's in an area that gets hit every time there's a downturn, yeah, I would exit it. I really would.
Mm-hmm.
Now, doing an expensive property where you're doing improvements, I would honestly take a look at how much inventory you're competing against, because there's a very different number for every category of value. Orange County, I'm a little bit more familiar with, but in Orange County, probably have less, like 3 months of inventory. If you have over a $3 million property, you have 2.5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're basically saying is let's fix the property and get into the teeth of it, 3-year inventory in a flat market. So make sure you know what kind of inventory you're going to compete against, because what happens is a lot of people have tons of equity, and if they're ones that need to sell, they're just slower to get there and do it, and there's the comps.
Right.
Okay, so you're not going to get inundated with lender-owned properties this time. It's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's too many safeguards in the last 8 years for lending that's been so confining that people have had to have real jobs and real FICO scores and real down payments. And what's very unique about this cycle, we haven't touched a dime of equity. We owe less on credit, like equity lines in 2019 than we did in 2005 by quite a bit.
Interesting.
So all that equity is in position. So even if you got in trouble, you'd probably be in a 50% equity position. Trustee sales, if you ever go there, they don't buy them at 51%. They buy them at about 80.
Yeah.
So you're still going to end up with some money.
Mm-hmm.
But more importantly, the bank isn't going to end up with inventory. That's where you have problems. When the bank starts dominating the comps. So in the 80s, they were 1 in 4 comps. If you're an appraiser, you can sort of ignore that. That's not the market. In the 90s, it became 4 in 10, wow. 40% of the market. You have to pay attention to it. In 2008 and 9, it became 80% of the market. It was the market.
Wow.
So it didn't matter what you did to a house. We would buy a house for 60 grand, fix it with 25 grand, so it's perfect. Put it on the market for 125, 25 offers in 2 days.
Right.
Appraised for 95. Why did it appraise for 95? Because the only other comps were vacant REOs with no kitchen.
Right.
But those were the comps.
Yeah.
And so the appraiser was really in a bind. 25 offers for full price, that's a statement of value. How do you ignore that? He has to ignore it. Why? Because he has a review appraiser that's going to come over the top and say, well, that's ridiculous. Every other comp, so it's 95, not 125. He will never get an appraisal assignment again from that lender.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was in a bind. It was just a weird time.
Yeah.
But that's why that ratio is really important, and it won't happen this time. It's just going to be competitors that are owners that own stuff that decide they want to sell bad enough to maybe reduce the price. A lot of times, too, prices get higher than they should. People ask, well, hey, I'm going to ask for 85 grand more than I should. And then when they talk about I got less than I wanted, it was actually the market price anyway.
Right. Yeah, and these are great questions. And so again, if there's more follow-on, we're trying to address these as best we can. You'll get an opportunity to answer as a follow-on. Harry, I want to get back to you because you mentioned in your last segment about the lending piece. What do you have in store there?
Here's a concern that I have. So one of the things that we've seen of recent and over a long period of time as well is that people have engaged in appropriate and proper asset protection planning, and they have isolated property into a particular limited liability entity. But the property has value, a lot of equity, one deed. So I have ABC LLC that has ABC Street property in it, and the equity in that property, or the property's all paid off, is $1.5 million, $2 million worth of equity on one deed. So although we have isolated the liability inside to the value of that property, it's still $2 million. We have protected that property, so we won't allow a creditor to get in and reach that $2 million. That's very good, but still inside, if I have a landlord-tenant liability, is $2 million. And when we didn't have any LLCs, or we just had a collective property, it didn't matter because it was all one big pile to satisfy the claim. Now that I have it narrowed down to the $2 million worth of equity, one of the things that we might want to consider from an economic and a risk management point of view is to reduce the amount of equity that sits inside that particular LLC. And so what we can do is we can borrow money against that, as long as the economics are such to do that, where we have a positive, because we should have had good positive cash flow that's coming in, and we can take that money, or so we can reduce, so the $2 million equity, maybe we can reduce it down to $1 million worth of equity with $1 million loan against. And I know, Bruce, that you guys do a lot of hard money and lending. Then we take the $1 million that we've received from there and we place that into another protected entity to protect that $1 million. So now we have the cost of the money on one side, which is a deductible cost of the money, and then we have earning of the money on the other side. So it's the delta between the two. So it's not really debt. It's really, we're using leverage here to better increase our asset protection. So now I know if I have a lawsuit at that one property, and if I've lost that lawsuit and it's a $10 million judgment, and it was a $2 million property, now it only has a $1 million equity. I've reduced my exposure by greater and then 50%.
You know what's interesting? I'll just bring up something because it dawned on me what other people might be thinking. It dawned on me that even though you've done everything right, you could still lose that property.
Absolutely.
So LLC, insurance, and everything, you could still lose that property. I don't think that's ever dawned on me in my entire life.
Absolutely. Internally, absolutely. You'll lose that property. You'll lose what's in that box.
Right.
You won't lose what's outside of that box.
Yeah.
And you won't lose the property primarily if the liability comes to you, Bruce, because they won't be able to get in.
Correct.
But if we have a landlord-tenant liability and it's beyond the insurance that we have, we can definitely still lose that property.
Yeah, well, fantastic. We're hitting up against the wall here right on time. Bruce, thank you very much. Great information. Harry, yeah, you're welcome. Great. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on. Look for the follow-up email with a chance to get one-on-one with our experts here if you have additional questions. And also look for our next episode of Wealth Protector TV. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.